Welcome to the Outpost, where we turn your garage, dining room table, and basement into a proper battlefield. On today's episode, we're going to talk about why we're going to do this channel, give some hobby updates, talk about some Alpha Strike 350 list building, and a couple of unique units that I like to play on the battlefield. So why this channel? Recently, we hosted KSAG up here in Minneapolis, and what was nice about that was we got about 100 gamers from all over the country to come play Alpha Strike 350 doubles and classic narrative events, classic grinder events, and a variety of other events. It was a fun event. There were lots and lots of people there. And one thing I consistently heard, though, from newer players especially, was just the struggles with doing the hobby, building lists, and ultimately being competitive. And for a while now, I've thought about starting a channel to kind of help people out when it comes to hobbying, building terrain, doing modeling, doing narrative stuff, having fun and putting on a good time, and making sure that you can enjoy your hobby and also be competitive. So put this channel together. Hopefully we can make that happen. So in the first section of this episode, we're going to talk about some hobby updates. Like I said, we had KSAG. I helped run the doubles event on Friday and the singles event on Saturday. It was very well attended. We had some great armies. We had some great competition. I think there was close to 32 or 36 players for the doubles event. For singles, it was over 40. There's talk about continuing KSAG as a multi-day convention next year here in Minneapolis in the December timeframe, hopefully. And I'm really excited for that. It was a really fun event, really great. Had a lot of people come out from all over the country, a lot of interesting and fun armies. And if you weren't able to make it to KSAG this year, I would strongly encourage you to make it to KSAG next year. In painting news, I've been expanding my Comstar / Word of Blake collection. I'm probably going to go to Adepticon. That's basically a done deal. Got my train tickets, got my housing arranged. For the singles tournament, I'm going to be playing with a buddy of mine here locally named Jamie, and we're going to be playing Comstar. We've got a whole lot of fun stuff in the works for the doubles tournament. So I've been looking at that collection, which is sizable, but not huge. I wanted to play some different units and some new units for that. So I picked up 2 champions, which I saw guys play at KSAG. And what I like about the champion is that they're medium mech, 10 move, TMM of 2. The damage profile is 3/3, generally speaking. I mean, there's some variations there. And then their HP, as you will, their armor structure is usually around 10 points, which is a kind of a sweet spot, I think, for medium mechs. And they range in the like low to mid upper 30s, depending on what abilities and what variant you take. The one thing I really do like about the champions, though, is that a lot of them come with flak 1/1/1, which, if you're an inner sphere player like myself, you'll know can be difficult to sneak into a list. Clans tend to have pretty good flak availability, and oftentimes they'll be in the 2s, sometimes even the 3s. So when you're playing inner sphere, you kind of have to go out of your way to find flak 1/1/1. I typically don't count on flak 0 star at all. But the champion's a way to get your medium kind of mid-board brawler skirmishers into your list, but then also include a little bit of flak in there. And we did see at KSAC a lot of VTOLs, and helicopters. Greg from Colorado in particular ran a pretty heavy VTOL list for doubles. I saw quite a few of the top players running VTOLs, and I think at Adepticon, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of folks saw the better players running VTOLs and they try to sneak them into your list. So I like the champion because of that. I also bought a couple anvils. I bought 2 of them actually, but I'm only going to end up running one of them, I think, in my Comstar list. So I painted him up as Comstar as well. I like the anvil. Again, it's a nice medium kind of skirmisher brawler mech, but it gives you some ECM. Now I know that Adepticon is clan invasion, so you wouldn't expect to see a lot of C3 at that event. But it could happen, and you don't want to be caught without the ECM in the list. And if you can just kind of sneak it into a unit that you're probably going to have on the board in most lists anyways, it gives you coverage instead of trying to go out and find a unit that just has ECM and then trying to guess whether or not, oh, does this unit have C3? Do I have to now totally modify this mission list and squeeze this hovercraft or infantry unit or mech into here when I really don't want it? And the Anvil, again, is a nice solid medium mech with TMM2, about 10 points of damage, throws about 3 dice at medium range. So it's something that I already personally want in my list. And if it can include ECM in there, then it's just a bonus, in my opinion. The last thing I picked up were a couple partisans. Partisans are my favorite support and long range support, specifically long range support vehicle right now. In fact, we're going to dive into it a little later towards the end of the episode when we talk about units of the episode. It is the featured unit of this episode. I like the partisan. I got 2 of them. One I've modeled to be the refit. So it's got just standard guns, but then I went ahead and 3D printed some LRM 15/20s. I'm not really quite sure how many tubes are in here on the print, and posted that up on top of one of the chassis so that I'd have an LRM model, which I think is a really, really good option if you're looking for long-range sniper support, but also trying to squeeze some indirect fire into your list. It's kind of dual role, so you can do both with it instead of having to have a dedicated long-range sniper and then a separate indirect fire model within your list. Been working on some terrain. I did about 14 bases of trees. We did 7 sets of pine trees. They turned out really nice. I just buy them from Amazon. Then you don't have to worry about monkeying with glue and clump foliage and armatures and things like that. So I got a set of like pine trees. They come in various sizes, probably about a third of them in the pack were not appropriate scale for Battletech, but I'll use them for 28 millimeter and 20 millimeter gaming, 15 millimeter gaming. And then I did the same for some palm trees. And I did about 7 bases of palm trees that I'll use on my desert board. Also been thinking about with a buddy trying to put together some sort of coastal or beach board. Still trying to wrap our head around how that would work in a competitive format, but in normal standard garage or basement play for scenarios and things like that, I think it'll be fine. I've been having problems with my 3D printer. I think it's at the end of its life. I can't seem to get it to work. I've replaced about every single part I could imagine on it. So I might be getting a new one of those. And then I built a cave board a while back, and I've just been putting some finishing touches on it. It's a really fun board. All the terrain pieces on there can be flipped over. And so if you've got your standard 10 pieces for an Alpha Strike 350 board that you would put down, it's actually 20 pieces. So you put 10 on the board, but you can flip them. Well, I shouldn't say all of them. Most of them you can flip over. And so they're kind of different base shapes on either side. And then the way I like to play just the board itself when I'm playing with friends or with my kids is that you can't indirect fire over the pieces because there's a ceiling. And then we only allow VTOLs to fly height 4 in there. There's some pieces that aren't double-sided, some crystal formations. I got a cave entrance, things like that. But that's a fun board as well. Let's see. I've been gaming with my boys over Christmas break. I got a 5-year-old and 10-year-old. 5-year-old typically just put 100, 150 point lance action on the board. We've transitioned from basic Alpha Strike rules to variable damage rules with him, and he's been picking up on that pretty quick and having fun. I've painted up army for both of my kids. The youngest plays Merrick's, specifically Stuart Dragoons. And it's a lot of heavy, big, chunky mechs, all the things that a 5-year-old would love. And then my oldest has a quite extensive Jade Falcon army that I've painted, although he's getting to the point where I probably could trust him to start painting mechs on his own. So we've been talking a little bit about him getting into a new faction, and he's been talking about Ghost Bears. So maybe we'll see if that happens. But with the oldest, my 10-year-old, There are a couple of younger kids who played in the tournament. They did pretty well. You know, they don't quite understand concepts and things like that, and so they don't place particularly high, but they had fun, and I'd love to be able to bring him to some of the Wednesday night gaming that we do and have him come out to some events as he gets older. So we started talking about list building. So I introduced him to the Versal, the Alpha Strike Versal website, which I think is a really good option for list building. And if you are using the MUL and you're not using Versal, you should go Google the Alpha Strike Versal list building website. It's independent, but it pulls from the MUL. And in fact, you can click on the individual mechs and units in there, and it'll actually take you to the MUL and show you the card, which is nice. But what I really like about it is you can sort by Alpha Strike stats. And you can see all the relevant stats side by side. So when you're searching for units, you can look and see, so you want to look at all the champions, right? You can see their name, their variant, their points, their movement, their armor structure, their damage, and their abilities all side by side and compare. And you don't have to click back and forth or open multiple tabs. And it's really slick and it's really nice. The other thing I really like about it is that you can export it to a printable sheet right from there. So you don't have to then go into MUL and rebuild everything. You can also get an account and save it on the server. So if you're at your game night or at your buddy's house, you can log into your account and pull it up. They do have a game mode, so you can actually track everything electronically. So you don't have to print stuff out, or you can print it out and track it that way. I prefer to print it out, so I have a copy because you never know if your phone's going to die or if you're going to lose connection or service in the middle of the game, and you don't really want that to happen. So I like to print mine out. I always print mine out, and then I have a laminator at the house, and I'll laminate so I can use dry erase. Because if I find a list that I really like, I'll throw it into the folder, and I'm able to recycle it. Let's see. I've got a Hinterlands event coming up. A buddy of mine's putting it on for New Year's. So we're going to play just a one-day Hinterlands campaign with a couple of us. We're doing 100-point lists. We can only pull from the periphery general list for Ilclan to build a list. It's been a lot of fun building those lists. He's really encouraging narrative play and backstory on pilots. He gives little rewards if you do that. So those of us who are playing have been working on our mercenary companies. My company is called the Parish Council. It's loosely based off of, so the backstory to them is that they were part of the governing council on a planet that was occupied by the Jade Falcons. I decided to use parish like they have down in Louisiana. They have different parishes for the governing bodies. And they were disenfranchised council members who kind of revolted against their Jade Falcon occupiers. And so they got this nickname because that's what they actually were from the parish council. Eventually, they were forced off planet and they started a merc company and now have returned to the hinterlands. Now that the Jade Falcons have left and are hiring themselves out. My list is it's going to be squishy. It's very, I wanted to run a full lance, and it's supposed to be the recon lance of this parish council group or mercenary company. And so I've got a Dervish 6MR Quasit militia mech. It's the 51T version, a Wasp 3P, and an Oscout 12R. I'm really excited to run this. I think it's going to, like I said, I think it's going to be squishy. It doesn't have, it can't take a lot of damage, but it's got some speed to it. It doesn't dish out a ton of damage on the attack side. But I think it has enough to get the missions done. We've only got a preview of one mission, so I'm not 100% sure that like what the missions actually are. We've just been told you're going to want hands for picking stuff up. And the Dervish does not have hands, but it has quite a bit of fire support. That 6MR is a 342 with 9 points of damage. It also has a single indirect fire, which for a 100-point game, most guys that have been submitting their lists are running 3 or 2 pilots. So that might be good. It has jump, so it's maybe a little more survivable. That's also my commander. On the militia mech, it's kind of a junky mech, but it's cheap. It's the Quasit's only 22 points for its base model. it is Team M2 with Speed 2, and it's 2-2. So it's basically Phoenix Hawk that can't jump for a little bit less. Now, the problem with it is it does have basic fire controls. So out of the gate, instead of skill 4, it's basically skill 5. But I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that because I did such a good job on my write-ups and narrative for my pilots, that I can boost his skill out of the gate and get him on par with everyone else. Um, the Wasp, the 3P is great. It's like 19 points. It's team M3, move 14 with a jump. That's what I'm really going to rely on there, is that he's going to be jumping around to get his TMM up to 4, grabbing objectives. It's all energy weapons. It is squishy with only 4 points, but with a TMM4 and that speed, really, he's not going to be doing damage. He's going to be jumping around and trying to grab objectives. And then last is that Oscout, which is fantastic, if you ask me. It is move 16 jump. For TMM3, it's 111, so it does have a longer range attack if it wants to. But it has ECM, it's got energy weapons, and it's got stealth. So if I jump and get my TMM up to 4, and then my stealth package gets it up to 5 at medium range, 6 at long range, that mech is going to be just running around grabbing objectives as much as it can. And that's really going to be how I play this. Is very lightning quick, speed, jump in there, grab objectives, get out, finish the game. I don't want to spend a lot of time brawling and fighting guys. I've seen some of the other lists. They're looking at bringing Cyclopses and Zeuses, and someone talked about bringing the Xanthos, and they're going to be things that can just kind of wreck these mechs in a heartbeat. So I'm hoping this is fun. We've done this in the past. We've done some narrative stuff on New Year's, and it's always been a lot of fun. You just kind of have to lean into the narrative, and if you die, you die, and if you live, you live. So I'm really excited about that. I also made a custom bounty hunter from this list. I converted up a Hercules recently because I don't like the chunky metal one. I used an exterminator body, and then I cut the arm off of an extra Centurion that I had, the gun arm, and put that on the exterminator. And then I took the old hand arm, the arm with a hand from the exterminator, and I put it back on the champion. So it was a champion with 2 fists, and I kind of liked how it looked, but also there's not a champion, or there's not a Centurion that has 2 hands. So I was trying to figure out what to do with it. And then this Hinterlands event came up that we're playing in, and then we're doing, and I said, ooh, I'm going to make a custom bounty hunter out of this. So I started working on him, and I found a gun that he could hold in his hand to kind of put that LBX 10 AC back on him. And then I decided I gave him a poncho and a cowboy hat, and then I basically gave him a whip. I'm using the in the stats that I kind of done up him for the fluff is that he's a custom mech. He dropped the LB10X because he wanted to be able to have 2 hands as a bounty hunter to restrain his opponents. And then he kind of basically becomes Omni because he can get different weapon systems and pick them up. And then the whip is actually a mech taser. And so he can use that to immobilize mechs and grab them and restrain them and then bring them in to fill that bounty. As far as the cowboy hat and the poncho goes, I just thought it would be cool. I'm half jokingly, half seriously saying that the poncho gives him stealth armor because or maybe it has mimetic armor system on it because it breaks up his signature, his heat signature, and his electronic signature, and it just looks cool. I'm really excited for it. I don't know if it's going to get used or not, but it's fun. I nicknamed him Big Iron because that's what he has, this giant LB 10X that he walks around with usually, and he uses that to bring his bounties in. So I'm excited to play in this event. I think it's going to be really good. If you haven't done a narrative events, I'd encourage you to do so with your friends. It kind of takes the edge off if you're doing a lot of competitive play or just like meetup play where you're bringing lists and you're trying to win games. We're all doing up bios on our crews and on our companies. And instead of just writing something up in a Word document and just hitting send and it's just type, a lot of us have been doing graphic design. We've been pulling in AI pictures of pilots. We're doing up bios for them, doing the same for Met companies. So I've had a lot of fun doing that. If you're new to that, like one of the things I like to do when I come up with like make believe pilots or non-player characters is loosely base them off of like people that you know that your friends in your play group don't know, and then just pull that stuff in. Maybe it's a nickname, maybe it's a funny background story, something like that. And then when people ask questions or you're in the moment trying to come up with lore, you just tell a story about a friend of yours that they did, or you describe them in some way, and then you don't have to really wing it. And it ends up being a lot of fun. So, for example, my um, my closet pilot is named for my mother, my not my mother, my wife's father-in-law. How do I want to say this? Which would be my dad. And so he's got some background there about some things that he's done, calling moonshine that he makes holy water because it's like a family joke, etc., things like that. And so it just allows you to bring some flavor to your characters, and then you're kind of invested in those characters as far as narrative play. So I'd encourage you to do that. If you're doing narrative play, it's a lot of fun. We're not just coming up with company backstories, but also company logos. So that's been a lot of fun as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. If you're doing narrative play, sometimes I'll even do it with my competitive play. Just come up with a little backstory. You can put it out next to your army for the painting competition, and just give some flavor. It helps you really enjoy just a different aspect, some of the creative or lore-based aspects of the hobby. Let's see, Adepticon, I talked about that. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, which is going to be list building, kind of what my thought process is. How do I build a list for 350, 100 points, 250, other formats, etc. And so we'll get into that here in a second. All right, we're back, and we're going to get into the heart of this first episode. And this is how do I go about building lists and what my thought process is for building lists. It's primarily going to be a discussion about 350 for the Wolfnet format, because that's mostly what I play with my group. Although it can be used in both 250 formats for, like, say, doubles, or if you're running some other format in another region of the country or with another game group, or you decide to do some pickup games, things like that. So the first thing I want to say is when you're building lists, don't stress about it and try to have fun with it. I always try, when I'm building my lists, to first start off with a bit of lore or narrative. It might be a faction, a story, a paint scheme that I like, a book I read, a short story that I read. Those are the types of things that I like to start with. Or maybe it's a hobby idea that I came up with. Over the summer and in the fall, I really leaned into doing up, say, for example, my pirate list. And I wanted all the mechs to look different, and I wanted to be able to kit them out with different things that made them feel piratey, and I want them to look really worn down and rusted. And so I built a whole list, and I played for 6 months running pirates. And the start and inspiration for building lists and getting the collection going was these pirates. And then as I built the pirates, I gave them pilots' names, I gave them character, things like that. And even though a lot of my games were played in more of a narrative setting, I did play in some tournaments and some events with them, and they were very competitive. And I find myself that when I lean into the story a bit more, I lean into the hobby a bit more, I invest into the force a bit more, that I enjoy the list building process more. And I enjoy playing the games more because I'm not working myself so much up about the competition side of the hobby. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be very competitive. You can. There's a lot of guys who showed up at KSAC and at some of our other events. They'll cosplay, they'll hand out unit badges, they'll do really cool display boards, and they're very competitive and they're very good gamers. A lot of them place very highly. A lot of them win events, myself included. But if you can't find yourself having fun, then that can really damper the list building process and make it much more frustrating. Because if you're not performing well and your lists aren't doing well, there's kind of nothing to fall back on, at least in my opinion. And so that would be the first thing I do, is start with some lore, start with some narrative, start with something that you really like about the universe, about building the lists, about the type of force you're running. The next I would say is challenge yourself. If you keep running the same old list and same old list and same old list in the same style, maybe it's time to switch it up, buy some new units, try a different style of play, things like that. Is there a new way to play? Are there new things to paint? Is there, I oftentimes will go into the MUL and I'll find a unit with a certain stat line, but there's other units that have very similar stat lines. And so can I go buy a slightly different version of basically the same thing? There's not a big difference, say, between an Ostrock and an Ossol, and some of these other medium skirmishing mechs. So if I buy a different force and I want to paint up a different force, can I just buy a different mech that kind of fulfills the same role? So that helps you mix it up. It helps keep the hobby fresh. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed because there are a lot of options and a lot of selections out there for making your list in the MUL, I mean, sometimes hundreds and thousands of options, start small, start with a minor faction. I've really enjoyed playing a lot of periphery states recently, my pirates, my Taurians, not mercenaries, but with this lore event, we're doing this. We're limiting ourselves to periphery general only for our mercenary companies. That can really help you narrow down your selection, and so it's not so overwhelming. And what I found is really nice about the MUL and about Battletech in general is everyone kind of has access to the same tools, even when you limit yourself like that. By having a minor state that doesn't have as many options, like there's still tools available in that list. There's still things you can do. The points are still pretty balanced. And so by limiting your choices, it might help you narrow that down and take away some of the anxiety when you get into the MUL and see those things. The other thing that I've mentioned before that I'll say it again is, if you haven't got on the Alpha Strike Versal website to build lists, you got to get on there. You can see all the relevant Alpha Strike stacks in basically like an Excel format side by side. You can search by unit and you can compare all the Warhammers together side by side that are available in that faction, and then find the best one for you instead of having to constantly skip back and forth between unit cards on the MUL. So I'd strongly encourage you to do that. It makes searching and comparing units such a breeze and so nice. And then the last thing you want to do, or that I always do before I build a list, is I choose a theme, or I designate my, what I call the philosophy of use for this army, for this 350 point list, or the POU. So what is this philosophy of use? What does this mean? It's, what does this list want to do? What do I want to do with the list? Or what is my style of play for this list? What am I trying to achieve? What is its outcome? Is this a list that wants to brawl in the middle, right? Does it want to kite up the side? Does it want to stand back and snipe? Does it want to have a lot of speed, a middle amount of speed, no speed, lots of armor, lots of long range shots? Does it want to be able to get short range shots in? There's lots of ways you can dice this game and build your lists. I've ran lists that are light mech heavy, medium mech heavy, heavy mech heavy, heavy vehicle heavy, hovercraft heavy, VTOL heavy, with varying degrees of success. But most of the time, there's a way to make those lists work. And so figuring out what your philosophy of use is and having kind of a guiding principle is, how do I want this list to function in my mind, will help put some guide rails on how you build the list to make sure you kind of stay on track. Then once you have an idea in your head for how the list is going to look, you want to start adding units to that list that fulfill the kind of the dream or the aspirations or the vision for the list. So you have your own philosophy of use for what a specific unit within the list is doing. In order to do that, you need to really make sure you're familiarizing yourself with your missions, and then assign roles to those units. And when I say roles, I don't mean the roles that are in the MUL. It's roles within your style of play and within the list that the unit's going to do, right? You're not going to give an Atlas the job of going and capturing the flag and capture the flag. But an Atlas might be useful in capture the flag if it's the right atlas and you have the right philosophy of use, right? But if you don't have that right philosophy of use and you're throwing an atlas in there because you think it's cool and it's great, it might not work out, and then your list might not be as efficient at playing that mission, right? So you want to make sure that you're covering those things as you're adding units in. What is the purpose of this unit? What is it doing in this list? Does it have a purpose? Does it have a role? How will I put it into my sub lists, my 250 lists? And if it doesn't have a role, get rid of it. Find something else that will work within that list and with that style of play that you're trying to do. And then the last thing you want to do is look at variants for other mechs and in their classes, in the same class, the same chassis even. Sometimes you can find a mech. Let's take one of my favorite mechs to play right now. It's an Ostrak. You can go and look, and there's, in any given factions list, there might be 2 to 7 different Ostraks that you can take. When you compare them all side by side, there's minor differences. And depending on what you're trying to do, a different Ostrak might fit into that list, but you also might be able to trim points. If you have an Ostrak that's a 330 versus a 331 for its damage profile for what its attacks do, if you take the 333, you might save a couple points because that one long range damage is probably not doing much. And you're going to be playing that Ostrak in kind of a mid-board skirmish role anyways, right? And so sometimes looking at those different variants and those different chassis within the same class can help you identify mechs that help you trim points, save a point here or there, allows you to sneak other units into your 350, which allows you to better put your 250s together, but may also reveal units that you weren't aware of that could fulfill those roles. I'm going to go over a couple examples of some lists here in a second when I talk about my core list and my support lists also. And so when I start my list and I start my core is always going to be, what's the main thing that this list wants to do? So like when I was running my pirates, I wanted to try to make light mechs work, specifically bug mechs, right? I kind of glommed on to this idea that I wanted to have the core of my list be bug mechs, right? Whereas in my current Word of Blake and Comstar build that I'm doing, I want my core list to be medium mechs that can do 3 damage at medium range and can take at least 10 hits, right? A combination of armor and structure. And so those are two very, very different lists that I might have. And so I'm going to build a core around those concepts and those play styles. And when I build those cores, I like to personally try to make lances and stars where possible, even though that's not always the case. But those two cores are going to be the heart of any 250 list that I build, right? So when I was running my bug mechs, I had about 6-7 bug mechs that form the 8 bug mechs that form the core, and those units they were everything. They were in almost all of my 8 sublists that I did, all of my 250 lists. Whereas I've got about 5 medium mechs in this Word of Blake list right now that are fulfilling that same role. And when I do my sublist lists, they show up in almost every single one of my sublists. So one of the things that I like to do, though, when I'm building these core lists is making sure that the core list can do at least 15 points of damage at medium range. And I also like to ensure that there's somewhere between 150 and 180 points of my total 350. And the reason I do that is because I want somewhere between 100 points and 70 points of support units. So I've got 2 core lists that I drew up real quick for today that I just want to compare real quick. And you'll see the differences really quick in these lists. The first list is a pirate list that I came up with. It's pulling from the Versal, and it's got a Victor, a Guillotine, an Ostrak, a Griffin, and a Quick Draw. The total number of points is 169, and then the total damage that it's going to do is 17 points of damage. So you got 3 mechs that do 3 each for 9 and 2 mechs that do 4 each for 8. So 17 points of damage. So it's going to fit in between my 150 and 80 rule of thumb. And then at medium range, it's going to be dishing out 17 points of damage. Perfect. The other list I have for a core list is a Capella Confederation list, and it's got a Blackhawk, a Charger, a Thunder, and a Jinjagu, and it's got 20 points of damage that it does at medium range for a total of 177 points. So there's an 8-point difference here, but 3 points of damage difference at medium range. Now, where these lists differ quite a bit is in the first list, it can take 51 points of damage or HP, whereas in the second list, the Capellan list, it can only take 39 HP. So it's 12-point difference in damage. So right here out of the gate, we can see that there are 2 lists that are relatively same in points, but they have these slight differences in that one does more damage, but the other one can take more damage. And so then you're going to build your support units around that core unit to make sure that you're filling any gaps in there. So do you need more speed? You would want to look at that. Do you need more armor? Do you need indirect fire? Do you need infantry support if you're gonna play into infantry for specific missions or have specific roles? Do you want a sniper in there? Covering units? Those are the types of things that your support units are going to do and the roles they're going to fill based off of whatever your core list is lacking. This also makes building your sub lists a lot easier because out of the gate, you have a core list that you're just going to copy paste into almost all of the missions. And then you're going to pull from your remaining 150, 175, 180 points of support units that you're going to drop in there. I know lots of other people have other ways of doing this, and that's totally fine. I get why people do it, and some of them players that do this are very good at what they do, and they're very good players. I know people that build a core 150, a core 200, and then they do their support in 50 unit or 50 point increments from there, and so then they're building these 50-point blocks. And a lot of people find success with that. I don't personally like to use that because I find building the 50-point blocks too restrictive in that you constantly feel like you've got to build these chunks of 50. But some people do that and it works for them. And if it works for you, I would encourage you to do that. Really what I want you to think about is having a system for building your lists that work for you, that help you complete the missions that are put in front of you during your tournaments and during your games. So after I build my initial 350 list. So I have my core, I've got my support, I've got it broken out. Maybe you've done 180 of core, you've done 170 of support. Maybe you've gone a little over the 180 recommendation. That's fine too, or a little under. That's fine also. And you have way more support, maybe you have way less support, but you got your list, right? And you've put it together. The next thing that I do is I break it down in an Excel spreadsheet. And when I put it in the Excel spreadsheet, I'm going to copy all the relevant data over. I'm going to put the unit name. I'm going to put their points. I'm going to put their skill. I'm going to put their move. If they have a movement type, I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to put their short, medium, and long damage in there. I'm going to put their armor structure in there. I'm going to put their special abilities in there. And each one of those stat points is going to be a separate column. So I'm going to break out armor and I'm going to break out structure because those are two different mechanics within the game, even though they're both classified under HP or hit points. I'm also going to look at what the short, medium, and long range are in different columns and add those up and look at those separately. And then I'm going to look at the TMM and I'm going to look at the speed as well. And the reason that I do this is it helps me visualize personally. It helps me visualize what's going on in the list. And then what I'll do is I'll start looking at totals and averages. So I look at the total number of any given stat line is for the whole list. And then when I build my 250 list out of my 350, I do the same thing. So what's the total HP? What's the total armor? What's the total structure? What's the total TMM? What's the total movement? This is total across the whole army list, right? So these numbers might be wildly large. And then I'll also run a formula to look at what the average is. And I like to have those two numbers side by side because it just helps me personally understand what the list is potentially good at and what the sub lists are good at. Sometimes you come to find out as you're building your list, it's like, oh, I thought this list was fast, right? And because I thought the average movement was 12 and a half, right? And I'm trying to build a speed list. But then over here under a brawly list that I have that has way more hit points and way more damage output, it's actually a little faster. It's at 13.1 speed. How did that happen? And then you can analyze that, right? But you can also look at what the total is, because sometimes the total is really important. Like I personally like to look at, when it comes to damage output, what's my total damage at medium range? I think that's one of the most important things to look at, what the total is at medium range. Personally, I like my medium range total to be somewhere between 20 and 25 points of damage on a 250 list. I think that's a good spot to be for damage output. But sometimes, you put that together and you find out, oh, I put all these units together that I really like and I thought would work well together, but it comes in at 19 or 21. And then you're looking at another list, sub list that you made, and it's up at 23, right? But sometimes that doesn't tell the whole picture, because sometimes you've got units that dilute the averages or dilute the number. And that might also be important, right? Like if you're running a couple of skimmers and a couple of, flatbed trucks in your list, that's going to dilute your averages. So you have to consider that as well. The other thing that I'm going to look at in my total 350 list and also my sub list is what I classify as primary and secondary abilities. My primary abilities, and now you may feel differently about this based off of how you play, but for me, primary abilities, there are 3 of them. And that's going to be your flak, your ECM, and your indirect fire. Flak, super important because people run VTOLs, right? It's unavoidable. If you go to a tournament, there's a good chance you're going to run into them. So I like to know in my 350 list at a glance how much flak that list is throwing. And then on my 250 list, how much is in each 250 list. There may or may not be a right number for how much you should run, but you need to be aware of it. And I personally like to at least include 1 unit with flak in every single one of my 250 lists, if possible. It's not always possible, but I like to try to have it in there. That's why I consider it a primary ability. ECM, if you're in eras that includes C3, you somehow got to figure out how to get an ECM unit on the board. And I personally like to make sure that ECM unit is on a core unit. I think earlier in the episode, we talked about the anvil. The anvil comes with that built in. There's a lot of light mechs, say like a Hermes, that have ECM built in. These are units that you, in all likelihood, are going to be running in most, if not all, your lists. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to think, does this person have C3 or something that my ECM can interrupt? Now, last minute before I get my game started, do I need to swap out this core component of my list and swap in this thing I didn't plan on putting there? It's better if it's already built into the core of any of your 250 lists and it's already present and accounted for. So you can just grab that list and you're like, you know what? I don't care that my opponent has C3 because I'm already ready for it. And then the last thing is indirect fire. And I know not everyone runs indirect fire. I personally love indirect fire. I think that probably most, if not all, of my 350 lists include at least 1 unit that has indirect fire 3 minimum. And so I like to make sure as I'm building my lists that at a glance I can look at my abilities list and see that I got my IF in there and that I'm not skipping it. And then I look at my secondary abilities after that. My secondary abilities are going to include things like my infantry transport, my C3 if it's applicable, and things like AMS, stealth, mass, tag, and snark. I know if you're going to run artillery, the offboard artillery support cards, or if you're playing in a format that allows you to run onboard artillery, tag may be a primary ability because you want to look, and artillery might be a primary ability because you want to make sure it's in there. I don't tend to run a lot of it, so I think of it as a secondary ability. And snark, some people build lists around snark, and if you're going to build a list around using the that ability in particular, you might want to move it into your primary ability, and how you rate your primary abilities. I want to make a special note on short and long range. When I'm building my lists, like I've said before, I generally speaking only look at medium range damage because it's where most of the fighting is going to happen on a standard 350 board. The boards are only 3 foot by about 4 feet. Within a turn or two, most of the units are going to be engaged at medium range. Anything that didn't move up by the end of the next turn is going to be within medium range. And that's where most of the fighting is going to be as you close. Now, you have certain units that go fast and they can close to short. And at the very end of games, oftentimes, or towards the end of a game, you'll start getting short range contact. But I typically don't count on it, or I don't plan for it when I'm building my 250 lists, except in a couple of circumstances, which we'll talk about here in a second. And for long range, I really don't consider it unless I've skilled down a unit. A unit that is skill 4 shooting at long range out of the gate is an 8 to hit. And your average target is going to be going to have either TMM1 with cover, so 10s, or TMM2 with cover, so 11s. And if they're TMM3 or greater, forget about it. So the shots just aren't reliable. Now, if you're taking long range and you want to count on it, you want a sniper unit on the board, you have to take a couple things into consideration. One is that you need to skill down. It needs to be either a 3, and if the points allow it and your play style and your lists allow it, a skill 2. Those units need to be able to either fire indirectly, so hide behind cover to protect themselves, or they need to be able to perch up on a hill so that they have line of sight, or if they're a mech and they can see over a hill to have line of sight and be able to go stationary. So they need to be able to, they need to be able to keep distance between themselves and the enemies so that they are a little more survivable, or they need to have the armor to survive. And so points can build up really quick on these units. And then you need to be able to, like I said, go stationary so you can get that number even lower. And then you need volume of shots. Long range shooting with 1 shot and 2 shots is not dependable, and in my opinion is not worth spending the points on to skill a unit down. Now, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a situation where you wouldn't skill a unit down who has a long range 1 or 2 shot. But the reason that you would do it is the reason that you would skill them down is not to improve their long range shots. You're skilling them down to improve their medium range shots so that they have an edge at medium range. It's a waste of points to skill down for 1 shot or 2 shots. But when you're doing volume of shots, when you're looking at 3 shots, 4 shots, 5 shots at long range, if you get some of those crazy clan units that have even more, it suddenly becomes worth it, because now, let's say you're a skill 3, you're stationary, which effectively makes you skill 2. You're long range, that means you're a 6 to hit. And if your target is TMM1 and has cover, now you need 8s. That's effectively a medium range shot. Now let's say they're TMM1 and they don't have cover. Now it's at 7s. Or let's say they're skill 2, or they're not skill 2, TMM2, and they don't have cover. Now they're 8s. Now when they close to medium range, your shots are even better. So they're just connecting more, but you also have a volume of dice to make up for the fact that you're losing that long range ability. And then skill 2 is even greater than that, right? And then you really want to consider making sure you keep some cover. But and the reason you want to do that is to try to take advantage of the ability to go stationary, to get that skill even down more, to connect even more with those shots. The other thing I'd recommend on long range shooting is that if you're going to count on it and rely on it, you have to have something that can get to the mid board and skirmish and brawl with your opponent to distract them from the big gun that's shooting them from the backfield. If you don't do that, you're going to open up opportunities for your opponent to take that unit out. You want to give your opponent a hard decision on that. So if you're gonna lean on long range shooting in your list, you want to make sure that it has skill 2 or 3. So when I'm building my 250s, the only time I even look at that column or look at that is if I have one of those lower skilled units in the list. Otherwise, I effectively think of it as 0. And then at short range, I don't really build for short range, except in that because most units, their short and medium range is very similar or the same. Sometimes it's a little better. I find that to be true on a lot of the light mechs and light vehicles. Their short range will be a little bit better. But even on your mediums and your heavies, where that's the case, they're going to end up, because of their speed, do most of the fighting at that medium range. So I kind of don't don't look at that short range damage on those vehicles. Where I look at it is on my speedy stuff. And what I actually do is I look at my speedy stuff and I go, because of their speed, they're going to want to close to short range and get into short range to engage. And they have the ability to do that very quickly. And so what I end up doing is I actually use that as a catalyst to skill those units up to like a 5, or sometimes in rare situations up to a 6, but usually up to 5 to shave a few points and save a few points. So a classic mech that I use is the Mercury. I love it. It ends up in a lot of my lists. It's very efficient. It's a very good light mech. And one of the things I like about the Mercury over some of the other light mechs is its speed is 20, which means its TMM is 4, so it has a little more defense because it's only got 4 hit points, I believe. But at short range, it's damage 2, and at medium range, it's damage 1. So if you can get that guy into close range or in the rear arc of someone, you're doing 2 or 3 points of potentially 2 or 3 points of damage. But because you're at close range, you don't need to have that skill 4 necessarily. You can go to skill 5, and if your target is TMM 2 or TMM 1, you're only looking at 6s or 7s, and that's pretty good. And if you can shave 3, 4, 5 points off a unit by doing that, because its primary role is shooting at short range, that's where I'm going to consider those short range things. So I'll look at my short range stuff very rarely. The other situation where it might look at the short range stuff is in 2 missions, and specifically in the 350 format. That's going to be capture the flag. First, because there's always at the beginning of capture the flag, if you have an opponent who knows what they're doing, which means they're going to present a challenge to you, is they're going to be either close or on those flag points in the middle of the board on the first turn. And so wanting to know what your short range damage is going to be for those first turns and for chasing stuff down and for competing over those objectives very quickly, because you should also have fast stuff, is going to be important. And then the other one is for King of the Hill, because King of the Hill always devolves into everything in the middle of the board in close range, blasting the bejesus out of each other. And so I might lean into my short range damage and kind of want to know what's my output at short range, especially for King of the Hill. But for most of the other missions, I don't really consider it. I'm really looking at what's my medium range damage, and I like that 20 to 25. I think that's a really solid spot to be for any given list. And like I said, if you can get in there with that 20 to 25, you have a good pool of dice to lean on and rely upon to your damage output. I know some people like to push that envelope above 25. And if that's your play style and you can make that work, I personally have a hard time making that work, because I find that once you start getting up over 25 points of damage and you start pushing 30, oftentimes you sacrifice mobility, which can be fine, because you could end up with a situation where you don't need that mobility and you just are going to gun everyone down, which is a way of playing. But personally, I like to have some mobility in there and to be able to take advantage of mistakes people make or errors I've made by relocating and redeploying. So my average totals, if I haven't gone over them, I like to have my HP around 60. I like to have my TMM averaging between 2 and 2.5. I like my movement to personally be around 12 points of movement. 10 to 12 is my average movement. So I generally don't take a lot of things that move super slow, like move 6, unless I'm using them in some sort of sniper role. I'll take only a handful of movement 8 units in most of my lists, and usually only if I can get jump on them. Although if they're a decent brawling mech that can move up and fight in the middle, I'll do that. But generally speaking, I like an average movement of 10 to 12. I think that's pretty good. And like I said, a medium range damage of 20 to 25 on my sub lists. And then I'm always looking for some flak, some ECM, some IF that wants to be in my core list or in my, with the IF, it's going to be support, but with the flak and the ECM, I like it to be attached to my core list if possible. Now, if you're playing earlier eras where you're not going to run into C3, you can forget about the ECM. Even in Clan Invasion, there's not a lot of C3, so you kind of have to know your game group. All this helps me visualize the amounts and the averages. So as I'm building my sub lists, let's say you're building your 8 sub lists for the 8 missions in the WolfNet format, right? You can start comparing them. And I found times where I'm building list for, say, Overrun or Headhunter, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, if I look at my averages and my totals, this is actually a better list than what I have for Stand Up Fight. And I actually would rather put this into Stand Up Fight, right? Maybe my damage output's better. Maybe my total hit points are better. And that's what I want in Stand Up Fight. But I've also done where I think I have this really lightning fast list for Capture the Flag, and then I go and look at my bunkers list, and I'm like, actually, the list I built for bunkers is even faster. There's more movement across all units. The average is better, etc. So that's something else that you want to consider when you're building those lists, is being able to visualize and look at those different components. Now, when it comes to um, damage output, I will make a special note on Capture the Flag. Capture the Flag is one of those missions where if you have less than 20 points of medium range damage, I think it's fine. I'll oftentimes run that as low as 16 or 17, because all that mission really cares about is your ability to get on the flag points as quickly as possible and retrieve those flags. And if you can do that in the first turn or two and win the game, then who cares how many shots you have? That game can end very, very quickly if you have the right build and the right amount of speed, especially if you get paired with an opponent who's not prepared for it and has just like a meandering medium list that just was kind of lumbering up, and they're being forced to sprint on turn one, and all you're doing is capturing all 3 flags and scoring. So on Capture the Flag, there's a little bit of a asterisk there, nuance. In the Wolfnet format, when I'm building my sub lists, I personally have gotten into the habit of building a list for every single mission, even though a lot of them don't come up or you're not going to see them, because in a typical Wolfnet tournament, you're looking at 4 or 5 missions being run. If you're doing a 2-day, you're going to run into all 8 of them, but only if you get into the top 8. And then if you're doing a casual event, it might only be 3. But I typically will build lists for all 8 of the missions. So it's going to be Stand Up Fight, Headhunter, Hold the Line, Overrun, Domination, King of the Hill, Capture the Flag, and Bunkers. Now, if you don't want to build 8 sublists, because that can be very labor intensive, especially when you have to start swapping things in and out when you find out your list isn't as good as you thought it was, and you eventually get on to your 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th iteration of your 350 list, which that Word of Blake list I told you I'm working on, I think has gone through 6 or 7 like revisions as I've found new models or things that work, or found problems as I've play tested and things like that. The other thing you can do is you can boil it down to essentially 5 lists. I think that Stand Up Fight, Headhunter, Hold the Line, and Overrun can more or less be lumped together. They all kind of play the same. They're a slightly different way of playing Stand Up Fight. Hold the Line, you really have stuff that's anchored in the back, and you have some stuff up front, that's running to the other person's side. And oftentimes it devolves into some sort of stand-up fight where you're trying to beat the person's runners and knock them off of their objective points, and then getting on their objective points. And so I've just found over time that my standard stand-up fight list usually is pretty good at playing that list. Same with Overrun. I've had the same experience. Headhunter, I generally, my list is a slight variation off my stand-up fight list, where then I just pick 2 units to be my captain and my XO. And then stand-up fight is kind of the core of that list. Now, I personally will build each one of these lists out, because I might in say Hold the Line and Overrun, I might try to say I had a light mech that was part of my core list that I didn't think was quite fast enough. I might swap him out for a hover or something like that, or a helicopter or something along those lines, or a skimmer. I don't know, and so there might be some little nuances. But one of the things I've found is that I'll build a stand-up fight list and a Headhunter list and a Hold the Line list, Overrun list. I'll look at my stats and I'll go, oh, wow, actually the Hold the Line list I'd rather run in stand-up fight when I look at the stat breakdowns, when I look at my totals and my averages. And so it helps me build a better and more refined overall list for all of them. And then the other 4 lists that you're going to build for are Domination, King of the Hill, Capture the Flag, and Bunkers. These missions play totally different than the first 4. And they also they also play different from each other. So that you're really going to have to lean into your support units that you've brought to do these. And so when you're building your support units out, you really want to think about, how are you going to do domination? How are you going to do King of the Hill? How are you going to do capture the flag? How are you going to do bunkers? For me, when I play domination, I like to do anchors. I call them anchors and runners. I want units that can anchor my back to objectives, brawl a little bit up into the middle, and then I want to do stuff to pull my opponent off of their back objectives. And I want runners that can, if they make that mistake or their ranks get thin, I can jump in there, right? I also want those runners to where if I have a gap in my own lines, I can go run and jump back on a objective that I've lost, right? So anchors and runners is how I run that. In King of the Hill, it's all about brawling. It's all about brawling. It's all about, can I get to the middle with enough beef and enough gravy, right? And can I duke it out longer than my opponent? And so when I'm building a King of the Hill list, I'm looking at heavy hover vehicles, right? And when I say heavy hover vehicles, I'm not talking about their HP and how much damage they do. I'm talking about their size. So if you find things like Maxims and Drillsons, things like that, that have a size 2, if I can get a Drillson on there and you get a Pegasus on there, guess what? I hold the objective turn 1 because I'm size 2 and you're size 1, right? And then from there, you're looking at, do I have stuff that can get there at the end of turn 2, and then do I have big stuff that can get there at the end of turn 3? So that mission is all about, I mean, it's a WWE cage match, right? It's dog pile in the middle and lets everyone punch each other to death at short range. Capture the flag, to me, is all about speed and snipers. So when you're building your support units and you're building your sub lists for capture the flag, it is all speed and it is all snipers all day long. So I'm running usually something light like a skimmer or some sort of other light hovercraft that's got a lot of speed but doesn't take a lot of damage. I'm running light mechs that are speed 20 to 22, 24 if you can find them. I'm running mid-range hovers that are around the 18 to 20 mark. And then I'm running maybe a couple skirmisher mechs that can move up to the mid board that have some staying power, but also dish out like, say, 3 damage at short range. And then I'm taking a sniper or two that can park on a hill that are skilled down to skill 3 or even skill 2. And their job is to pick off and nuke my opponent's runners from outer space, but they can also, in a pinch, reach across the board as they run for the home flag as well. So you're looking at speed, your runners and your snipers there. And then bunkers, bunkers is my least favorite mission to play. For some reason, I don't care for it. And it's probably because I don't like buying infantry and then paying the transport tax on them. Because you really need something that can get there fast, and you can't just take like the speed 10 hover infantry or speed 12 hover infantry that, are TMM2. They're just too slow and they're too vulnerable, in my opinion. But the 2 ways of playing it are cheap assault teams. The cheaper you can get the assault teams, the better. And really what you're relying on is the enemy hiding in the backfield with those things and being able to pounce on one of the bunkers if the enemy becomes too vulnerable, and then putting the bulk of your points into clearing the enemy off the bunkers so that you have an opening to blow them up quickly. And if you can't do that, then the other option is skirmishers and brawlers that can move up to the middle board, take the middle board, defend your board, take the middle board, blow up the middle bunker, and then move on to the rear bunkers and shoot them until they blow up. And that can be very difficult to do. But skirmishing and brawling or assault teams with skirmishers, I find work pretty good. I'm going to take another quick break, and then I'm going to pull up my current iteration of my Word of Blake list, and we'll break that down for you guys. And you can kind of see my thought process from there. Thank you. So now we're going to run through this Word of Blake list that I'm kind of working through. Not sure if I'm going to run this at Adepticon in the singles event or just play around with it for now for local fun games and games with my kids, but it is something I'm working on. Now, like I mentioned before, you can't be afraid of kind of chopping lists up as you're building your sub lists and finding things that don't work. One of the things I failed to mention was that when you're building your sub list is counting up the number of times a unit appears in a list. And sometimes that's fine. Like if you're running like that transport tax unit that is only there to transport that infantry, and that infantry and transport only show up in your bunkers list, like that's fine. But if you've got like 4 versions of the same medium mech, you got an Austral, an Ostrock, and a Champion, and they're all doing the same thing. They all have the same move and the same TMM and the same medium range damage, and there's nothing that distinguishes them. And you find yourself not running one of them in a lot of your lists, and you're only fielding at one time. Feel free to drop that. Like, just get rid of it. Put something else in there. That's a really important to remember. Like when you're building those sub lists, it's trying to figure out like what is actually being used and what are you going to lean on and what you're not. And is there something that would do a better job if you drop something? So, or can you skill something up, or do you need to skill something down because of it? So keep that in mind. So I've gone through this list a couple times. I always impulsively buy too much stuff at Aries and then put it in order and then rework my list and then have to buy more stuff. My wife loves it. But so this is probably the 7th iteration of this list. And that's okay. I probably will go on to its 8th or 9th after I play tested and see how it does at my local club. And some stuff I might like, some stuff I might not. So so this list at its core, what I wanted it to do was to be, I had a rule. I wanted my core list to be medium mechs that move at least 10. So that means they have at least a TMM of 2 that can dish out 3 damage at medium range. I really like medium mechs in this kind of zone in this area. Specifically, I like the Ostrock and the Ossoul. You'll see I have an Ossoul in this list. They can be very point efficient. They're very versatile. Having 10 points of health between armor and structure is fantastic. I really, really enjoy that. They do a really good job. And then 3 damage is nothing to laugh about, especially in like Clan Invasion and in the Succession Wars. It can be pretty good. And basically the catalyst in my mind for this list was I liked running the Ossoul and the Osrock so much that I wanted to build a list kind of around those two. So instead of having them as like pieces within a broader puzzle, I wanted them to be like the core of the list or that style. And what I found is you'll see there's not an Ostrock on this list. Part of it is I don't have a Ostrock painted up for my Word of Blake yet. But I do have an Ossoul and I'm waiting on getting the plastic. But I found a bunch of other mechs when looking through the MUL and on the Versal application that kind of fit that bill too. And a couple of them I really like. And we'll get into them here. But so the core of this list is those mechs. So we'll start off with the Austral OTL 4D. 33 points, 10 movement, 330, 55 energy weapons, which is great. You don't have to worry about those ammo hits. Then I'm running 2 champions. I'm running the 1 in and the 1 in 2. One's 34 points, one's 35 points. Both are 10 move. They're 331 for the 1 in, and the 1 in 2 is 431. But the thing I like about these is both of them are flak 111. And they maintain that 10 point kind of core damage. So right there, I'm up to 30 points of damage. I'm up to 9 points or 30 points of health, 9 points of medium range damage. Then I threw an anvil in there. It's 35 points. It's a move 10, 6 jump. That is jump weak, so I wouldn't count on that. But then it's 330, 10 points of damage. ECM. So I've got my ECM in there, and I've got 2 111 flak units and energy. So now I'm up to 40 points. I'm up to 12 points of damage at medium, and I'm up to 40 hit points. And then the last unit I threw in there, because I absolutely love this unit, is a 37 point Shadow Hawk. It's the Word of Blake variant, I believe. It's the 2HT. It's a 10 jump. It's 440 for its damage output. It maintains that 5 or 10 points of health and its case. And so right there in my core group of units, I'm up to 50 points of health, and I'm up to 16 points of damage. And everything's between 30 and 37 points, like 35 points a piece. It's like 175 points of total point values, which I think is pretty good. My math might be off a little bit on that. So that's like the core of this list. And when I build my sub lists, nearly all 5 of these units fit each time into every one of those. each one of those sub lists, with the exception of, to be honest with you, capture the flag, because I like to run lots of speed during capture the flag, and you'll see that in my support section. Um, so on the support side, I'm running a partisan heavy LRM tank. It's 42 points. It only moves 6, but it doesn't need to go fast. It's 3-4-4. I don't care about the fact that it's 3 at short range, because if something is that close to it, it's probably already dead. What I like about it is it's got that long range 4. I'm skill 2, so I'm really going to be able to reach out and hit stuff reliably. I'm going to get that volume of dice in there. But then I'm also indirect fire 4, which I think is fantastic on a long range sniper like this, because this thing's got a little more oomph to it. It's got, a lot of these long range IF, the LRM carriers and stuff, they only take like 4 or 5 points of damage, something like this. This one's up to 7. But it's got the 4 damage at long range to dish out. But then if someone tries to build a double hill or hide from me, because I'm hitting them at that long range with that skill 2, I got IF 4 that I can drop reliably on it. Because remember, IF 4, if you're stationary, you're basically still skill 2. You're not really taking that IF hit for indirect fire. So I've got that guy in there. I've got a partisan heavy tank with the refit version. I know a lot of guys run Shreks. I think this is a superior unit to the Shrek. I run them at skill 3. It's 28 points, 6 track. What I like about both these partisans is they're 6 track, so they can get up on top of a hill. You got a lot of stuff that's heavy that is IF and long range sniper that's only 4, and they can't get up on top of hills, which is a problem. It's 3-3-3. Same armor structure, 3-4. But what I like about the partisan refit over the Shrek is that it's flak 1-1-1. You pick up an extra point of flak when you run the partisan over something like the Shrek, which doesn't have that. Now you do have elementary engines, and we'll get into that probably a little later, when we specifically talk about these 2 units. But they're fantastic units. I'm running 2 Drillson heavy hover tanks with the SRM variants. They're 27 points apiece. What I like about the Drillsons over something like the Maxims is they move 18 instead of 16, which is pretty solid. Don't underestimate 2 inches. That when you're sprinting, you're going 27 instead of going 24. You really can get across the board. It also has a turret. It's also size 2. So when you're playing something like King of the Hill, you can jump out there and get on top of that thing and hold it a little more reliably. I got 2 light mechs in here. First is the Mercury. It's 20 points. He moves 20, 2-1, with a 2-2 armor structure. He's energy weapons, which is nice to have on him. I skilled him down to 5 because he is a scout mech and he's running around. I also brought a Hermes. I really like the Hermes. It's one of my favorite mechs to play in the game when it comes to light mechs. He's only 19 points. And that's because he's only 1-1-0 for his damage profile. Now he is a little more squishy because he only has 1 point armor and 3 structure, so he's going to take those internals a little more if he actually survives. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of these light mechs just get wiped off the board in a single round of shooting if the enemy does get close and connects. What I like about him is he's move 22 instead of move 20, so you get a little extra movement. So in Capture the Flag and a couple other missions, he can be really key. The other thing he does, just in case you do run into a sneaky sneak who's trying to bring a C3 build, is he gives me a second ECM. So he's already something that I want to play in a lot of missions like Capture the Flag. I might even run him in something like Domination. He moves 22. He can get basically anywhere on the board. But he's got that ECM. So if I'm not running the Anvil and not in a mission, like say in Capture the Flag, I can throw him in there, and then I got ECM coverage. Or if I'm running both of them, I got double ECM coverage. And then the last unit is a Sprint Scout helicopter. It's the troop transport variant. I skill him down to 6 just to shave on points. That gets me down to 7. So 26 VTOL move. 1-1 armor structure. He has no attack ability, and he's infantry transport 2, which is the key here, because I'm going to be transporting a foot level 1 half squad MGs at skill 5. He's only a 1/0/0 2/1, but he's a cargo 2, so I can fly these guys in that troop transport, and it only costs me 13 points. So I'm not paying for expensive battle armor to ride on Omnimex, which I don't even have in this list. I'm not paying for expensive 8, 9, 10 point troops with flamethrowers and missile launchers, or that I'm then putting that are, this huge cargo capacity that I then have to find, a 15, 20, 30 point transport to put in. I can just, for very cheaply, 13 points, I can get one squad that can maybe blow up a bunker during a game if I'm lucky. Some previous iterations I did of this, I monkeyed with the points on my partisans. I messed around with the Hermes and the Mercury. I actually got 2 sprint helicopters and 2 foot level, 1 half squad machine guns in there for 23 points. You get 2 strike teams. It's not terrible, but you're really counting on, when you're doing that, you're really putting your eggs in the, I think capture the flag is going to happen basket, or maybe your tournament organizers has told you capture the flag is going to happen. So this is kind of more of a backup. It's just to have in that capture the flag list. And so, if I was going to run, say, some of the core missions, I'm running the bulk of my core mechs in there. I'm probably going to run one of the support tanks. I like having the 2 support tanks in there because there's a big difference between 28 points on that partisan refit and 42 points on that LRM carrier. So depending on the mission you're doing, you can still maintain at least having a sniper on there, which I really enjoy sniper vehicles. If you haven't ran them, you should definitely try it. It can really improve your list. So, but I can say 14 points and maybe get something else in a list that maybe I don't need that LRM carrier firing indirect fire. I can just throw that refit in there. I also, on capture the flag, I'll run both of those things in there. So for, what is that, 70 points, I've got all this skilled down stationary sniper stuff, just wiping your skimmers and your hovercraft off the board, because those skimmers and hovercraft, they don't want to be in my backfield dealing with my sniper vehicles. They have too much else to do, which is capture flags. So I'll run both of those in there. I'll run double Drillsons in there in that list. I'll run the Mercuries and Hermes in that list, and then I'll probably run the sprint helicopter in there, and then probably the Anvil and probably the Austral would be the other things that I try to squeeze into there. My main list, I'm looking at those core 5 mechs. I'm probably going to add one of the snipers and something like a Drillson. I really like that Drillson. It's got some beef to it. It can get around, it can flank stuff, it can get in the rear, it can grab objectives, and it's got some weight. It does get a little expensive. I know that you can run some of the size 1 hovers that are more in that 25, 24 point range, 20 point range. But I really like running the Drillson. The other option that you can do here is swap a Drillson out for a Maxim. You do the troop transport one. It's also 27 points. You pick up troop transport. So you could drop that sprint helicopter and have infantry in there. So you're pulling double duty. It can run in main lists and be heavy, and it has a multi-purpose role. And then it can also transport infantry. The thing I don't like about the Maxim is it's a little bit slower. It only moves 16 instead of 18. It does have that elementary engine, which it doesn't come up a ton, but if you take an engine hit, you could just blow up right off and nuke yourself off the board. So you have to worry about that. In the most of the lists, I'm running the Mercury instead of the Hermes. But I will take that Hermes just because the Mercury does a little more damage, but I will take the Hermes if I need that little bit more speed or if I needed that ECM. And so you can see there's a lot of options in here. I have some snipers. I have some mid-range brawlers. I have I've got some really fast stuff. I've got some medium fast stuff. I've got stuff for kind of all the missions that I would work in there. And so this is just, and this is like I said, the 7th iteration. And, I've half toyed with some other iterations as well already. You can kind of see some of that thought process with some of those alternatives that I've mentioned in there. And so you kind of always want to be thinking about that, and then write the list, think about it, rework it. You don't have to do this. You don't have to obsess about it. I enjoy this part of the hobby, and a lot of guys enjoy this part of the hobby. I know a lot of the competitive guys, this is what they're doing to win. So if you're wanting to win, you want to place in that top, say 12 in a 40-man tournament, Um, these are just some of the things you have to be thinking about. You got to be thinking about, what is this? What is the philosophy you use for this unit, for this list? What is this army trying to do? Then what are these units trying to do within the context of that list? What is my core? What are my support units? What are the gaps that they're filling in? And not just the gaps on the overall list, but in the specific missions. And then when I look at the missions, like, what troops do I want to bring to these missions, and how are they going to fulfill that philosophy of use? And then where are my gaps from there, and what's getting used and what's not getting used, and what can I recycle? And sometimes it can just be a matter of like 2 or 3 points. Like, what are some of the alternatives that you could put in there? I've got a whole list of alternative mechs that I've swapped in and out and in and out in this list. Let me pull them up real quick because I've got a couple of them here that I wanted to just go over with you guys. So one would be like the Buccaneer 3R, right? It's 36 points. It's TMM2. It's move 12, so it's a little faster. It's 331, so it's got the 3. It's got an OV2. The only thing I don't like about it is it it's got 9 hit points, but it's got a melee weapon, right? So that might be a great mech to have for, King of the Hill. You get him in there and you just start swinging that axe. You got a little bit of reach there. You can do a little more damage because of it. It's only 36 points. And you're picking up 2 points of movement at the loss of one point of damage. And I will say this on it: it's got 6 armor and 3 structure. So you're losing 2 structure to pick up 1 armor, so it's a little more survivable. The other thing would be that Ostrak that I talked about earlier. The Ostrol is 33 points, the Ostrak is 34 points, and the difference is the Ostrak is OV1. So if you've got a point to spare, this list then in its current form is right at 350. But if I had a point to spare, I might put this in there because that OV might come in handy. But maybe I start building out my sub lists and I need to save a point. Well, here's a point I can save. I can drop the Ostrak and put the Ostrol in. They're basically the same thing, right? But I save a point, and all I'm losing is an OV1. That probably is totally worth it to do. Another mech that I considered putting in this list, and I didn't because it started getting a little too pricey for me, was the Hercules 9000. It's 38 points, right? So it's a little on the pricier side. And the reason is because its damage profile is 332. So you're paying for that long range attack. But what I liked about the Hercules is it picks up another flak 111, right? So you can put a little more flak in there into your list if you needed to go that route. So this list could potentially have 4 flak 111 units in it, and those lists are pretty core units. So if someone's bringing any sort of VTOL spam or a significant amount of VTOL points, like you're gonna be able to handle that. But the other thing I like about this Hercules is that it's armor 7, 3 structure. So it's still fitting that bill of what I want my medium mechs to do in this specific list, which is to have 10 points of damage, right? But it's heavy in the armor, so you're going to avoid taking a lot of crits, right? Because by the time it gets into internal structure, the thing's basically dead, and you're not going to care that you took a crit or 2 on the way out, right? So this guy's got some staying power because of that armor. You're going to worry about that less. Now, you're paying more. I'd rather have that Shadowhawk, which does 4 damage and has jump, right? It does 440. And that's why I ultimately dropped this thing and I put that in because I was building my lists out, my sub lists, and I wanted a little more damage into my lists. And that Shadowhawk helped me get there. And it also trimmed a point, which trimming a point in this iteration of the list helped me get other things into the list, right? Especially since I wanted to run, that partisan at skill 2, which means I can only run 1 skill 6 unit. Ideally, if I wasn't running that partisan at skill 2, I'd probably run my foot infantry at skills 6 also, and get that strike team package for bunkers to be even cheaper. So those are some of the mechs that I swapped out. You could easily fit something like a couple Gabriel's reconnaissance vehicles in here. You could drop one of the Drillsons, 27 points, right? And you could shave some points here or there and get 2 Gabriel reconnaissance vehicles in there. They're faster than the Drillsons. The damage output is almost the same, but they're faster. They have a higher TMM. They're very small. They go unnoticed. So that's really good. We talked about the Maxims as a potential alternative to the Drillsons. So as you can see, you start going through and you start swapping stuff out. You can start moving points around and kind of get to where you want to be in the list by incorporating these other units. You might have them in your collection. You might not. I always like to use it as an excuse to go spend money at Aries and buy more miniatures. I know some guys they can't afford to do that. Maybe they don't have the stuff, and they got to use their stuff at home. But if you start looking at variants and you start looking at the stuff you have at home, you might be able to field that unit just in an alternative way. And like I said, if you decide to, instead of running like a house, you want to run a periphery power or pirates or something like this, you can mix and match and bring stuff in that are different colors, and nobody's going to bat an eye about that or complain. So that's kind of the rundown of this current list that I'm working on. Next time I record, I'll go into more detail, because I know this episode's already getting pretty long. I'll go into more detail on how I break down, and I'll actually take my 350 list and put it into those 8 sub lists, and we'll kind of look at that on the screen. So I think that would be useful. But for this first list, I think that's a pretty good rundown. I'm going to take another quick break and get a refresher. And then I just want to talk to you real quick about the partisan heavy tank, because I really like it. And I talked about it a little bit here, but I want to go into some more detail and compare it to some other units, because I think it's it's not used enough, at least in our local meta and tournament scene in WolfNet. I know a lot of guys run sniper tanks and they run IF and things like that, but I think that the partisan deserves some love, and I think you guys are really going to like it. So I actually want to hit on that unit, and then next episode I'll jump into building out 8 sub lists from my primary 350 list. Okay, so the unit of the episode is going to be the partisan heavy tank. 2 variants in particular that I'm going to point out to you guys that I like, because they're both point efficient and they fulfill a lot of roles within, I think, a lot of lists, or have the potential to fulfill a lot of roles in a lot of lists. So the first is the LRM variant. So like I mentioned earlier, what I really like about this thing is that it's 344. So it's got that volume of fire at long range, which I like. It's like 36 points at skill 3 and 42 points at skill 2, which is the only way I would run them. I would never run them at skill 4, because you're just not going to rely on that long range, and your IF is going to be even worse. But it's armor of 3, structure of 4, so 7 points of damage. You're really going to rely on keeping the distance, trying to maybe hide in some woods on top of a hill so you have good line of sight with them. And then you want stuff that can brawl in the middle and distract the enemy from going after it. That's really how you're going to make these things survive. But that's how a lot of the long range vehicles work. It does have IF4, and it does have a turret of 244. So if something sneaks around, you don't have to worry about it. You do lose the 1 at short range. But if something's at short range, something's gone terribly wrong to begin with. The turret is also IF, which is awesome, because I've had stuff get behind me on this thing, and I've just been like, well, then I'm just going to indirect fire you. Right? And knock it out that way. Now, the partisans, unlike some of the other vehicles that you compare to, although some of them do have the elementary engine. This is going to be more relevant for the refit when we compare the refit to some other long-range sniper vehicles. That elementary engine, if you take an engine hit, so 1, you have to take an engine hit. So someone's got to crit you, and then they've got a 3? No, it's different on the vehicle chart. Whatever it is for vehicles, they got to get an engine hit, and then every turn you roll in on boxcars, you blow up. I've never had it happen, right? Not in one of these things. And so I wouldn't worry about it too much, those elementary engines. But on the refit, it also has elementary engine. It's got flak 111, which is freaking awesome, right? Because you can drop one of these on the board, and you're probably going to skill that thing down to begin with. 28 points at skill 3. At skill 4, I believe it's 23 points, which is very point efficient. It's, again, 3-4 armor structure. That 333 is awesome, because you can long range snipe with this thing. You're stationary. You're usually going to be stationary, so you're basically down to skill 2. You got a turret that's 233. so you can spin around and shoot things in your rear if they get behind you. Um, and it does work, and you pick up. The biggest comparison I have with this is the Shrek, the anti-infantry, because it's the same points, 23 points, and the stats are basically the same. The only difference is this has flak 111 and it gains elementary engine, versus the Shrek, which does not have flak but does not have elementary engine. I'm taking this partisan refit all day long over the Shrek. Now, I know they just put Shreks out in plastic, and Catalyst is trying to sell Shreks, and a lot of people own Shreks because they're very common, they're very available. And I think these refits are mostly available. I mean, a lot of the partisans are 222, and I honestly just wouldn't take a 222 partisan unless you could somehow pick up Flak 111 and you really needed it. But to take it for the Flak 111 to me isn't worth it. But to take 333 with a Flak 111 is, I think, really good value for the points that you're going to spend. On the heavy tank side for the LRM variant of this partisan, you're 4 at long range, but you're also picking up the indirect fire. And like I mentioned on the list review, like if someone's trying to hide from you, which is always the problem that I have when I take LRM carriers, which are a lot more squishy because they only have 5 points of damage. They really don't like hanging out there where they can be seen. They really want to hide. And even this thing, to be honest with you, most of the time I hide it. You just have a little extra survivability if a fast mech or a fast hover vehicle or a helicopter gets in your rear. You have that 2 extra points of damage. But if you do want to sit up on a hill and snipe because you got 7, you can take 7 points. Like I've done that plenty of times. But then if someone tries to hide from me because I'm dishing out skill 4 damage at skill 2 at long range, and I'm stationary on top of that. Remember, so I'm basically skill 1. So skill 1, long range makes me a 5. And then your TMM1 with cover. So at long range, I got 4 shots hitting you on 7. Like, who's not hiding from that, right? And if you're in the open, I'm hitting you on 6s. Like, it's dumb, right? Like, nobody wants to take that. So they'll hide. Well, guess what? I've got indirect fire. So this partisan heavy tank, the LRM variant, suddenly becomes this multi-purpose unit. Maybe you don't have the points to put, the long range sniper in there and the IF, because you'll see some guys run, well, I want to run, an LRM carrier in my list, but I also want to run a Shrek, right? Maybe you don't want to run those 2 units. You can have 1 unit that does the same thing. He gives you the option for indirect, but he also has the option to direct fire very efficiently and very good. So these 2 units are super spectacular in my unit, or this 1 unit that has multiple variants. And I'd really point you guys to trying to run them. I like to on my LRM variant, just to distinguish it. I've got a couple of them around. The one on the screen's got a 3D printed set of LRM pods. There's 3 of them on there. I think it looks pretty sweet. It's my favorite version that I've done, but I've taken like the LRM pods I've hacked them off of metal mechs and plastic mechs and put them on the sides for different factions and stuff. And it's very much a staple unit for me. I really, really enjoy it. If you're wanting to compare these units to other comparable units, like I said, the Shrek anti-infantry unit is also 333, same exact stats as the refit, but you don't have flak, and it's the same point. So I just don't know why you would take a Shrek over a partisan refit if you have the ability to do so. You can even get the refit. There's some other versions of the refit that have more armor and more structure, just like you can get with the Shrek. But if you can gain that flak, why not put that in your list just in case? As far as getting IF in a list, a lot of guys will take LRM carriers. Again, I think the LRM carriers, they're only 22 points, so they're quite a bit cheaper. So you can get that skill down to skill 3 or skill 2, and but you're only throwing the 3 dice and you're squishy. It doesn't take a lot to make an LRM carrier pop. And you would never take well, you could, but you got to have some pretty big cojones in my mind to hang an LRM carrier out in the open to direct fire with it. You can get the upgraded LRM carrier, which is not a terrible option. It's 355. So you're picking up an extra damage at long range, but you're still only 2 armor, 3 structure. And you're only 4 on the track when you pick up that 355 upgraded, so you can't get on top of a hill, which oftentimes you want to be, so you have better line of sight. And I'll also mention that these LRM carriers are also elementary engines. So having having elementary engines, on the partisans really doesn't matter when you're talking about LRM carriers. Now, the other big tank that I see a lot of, that I've ran a lot of, that I really like, that is a long range sniper and dueler, is the Alicorn heavy tank, the Mark 6. It's 39 points base, so you can really run the points up on this thing pretty quick. And I'll tell you what, it can be really useful and really effective. That 5 damage when skilled down to 3 or 2 can just ruin someone's day. And when you skill it, you skill it that way, you effectively get it into like the Atlas point range or something like that. It's like 52, 54 points, something around those lines, if I remember correctly. Might be a little more. It does have the turret. I mean, and the real thing with the Alicorn that makes it nice is it's 12 total points of damage. It's got, 6 armor, 4 structure, which is pretty fantastic, and it's going to stick around, but you're going to pay for that thing. And if someone hides from it, you're not going to be able to shoot. And I've done that. I've played plenty of games where someone takes one of these things, they park it up on a hill, and I just hide. I just skirt around a double hill or around some terrain, and I go take cover, and I just don't let that thing shoot, right? But if you had something like that, like say the partisan heavy tank with the LRM variant, and someone tries to do that to me, well, I'm just going to use one of my other vehicles or mechs to spot, and I'm still going to get the advantage because I have the indirect fire. So partisans, heavy tanks, the LRM variant and the refit variant for your long range sniping and your indirect fire needs. You should check them out. I'm not saying don't run those other lists or those other units. Certainly, like some of those things can be, like the LRM carriers can be a little more point efficient. And so if you're needing to trim points to get some IF into your list, that can be great. And certainly that Alicorn really punches hard and has some staying power. Like you can hang that thing out in the open for a while and be fine. So it certainly has a place. But I find that LRM variant partisan really strikes a balance between, I want, the upgraded LRM carrier and I want the Alicorn. Well, it's like you kind of get both, right? You get the IF and the direct fire, and you're not having to pay for both in a list. And so you can run them in multiple sub lists and run them in different ways. And then when it comes to the refit, I just don't know why you'd run a Shrek. I don't know why you'd run a Shrek if you have the refit available to you, because you pick up flak. And for those of us who are inner sphere players like myself, it's already hard enough to pick up sufficient flak, because most of the time you're looking at 0-star flak or 1-1-1 at the best, whereas you clanners, you're picking up a lot more flak a lot more efficiently, and sometimes even 2 flak or 3 flak or whatever it is, whatever nonsense clan tech you're able to run. So check those units out. Consider purchasing them. They only make them in metals. They only come 1 in a pack. They aren't the cheapest thing in the world. And I think that's probably why you don't see a lot of them. But I think they're totally, totally worth it. And you get modeling opportunities if you want to do the LRM refit and you want it to actually have LRMs. And then when I did my partisan refit, because it's got more guns than normal, I took the barrels off my LRM tank and I glued them onto my refit, so it looks like it has more guns, and that's why it does 3 damage instead of 2 like a normal partisan, right? At least that's what I tell myself. All right, this is going to do for this episode. Thanks for listening into my first episode. I don't know how often I'll get these out, probably as I feel like it and want to. But I hope you guys have a happy new year, and that the blessings of Blake be upon you. Take care.